Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Way to Wow show. I am your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm broadcasting from beautiful Los Angeles, California. Evidently, at this moment, we are the only place in the country that has under triple digit temperatures. Well, I should say Southern California indeed, because my guest is down in San Diego. Before we talk to Gregg, though, I wanted to actually, you know what? I didn't have a guest last week. I was off last week, so there's no one to remind you to go look at because there was no episode last week. So let's go right into talking to Gregg. Gregg is a pretty new friend of mine. He is the founder of the Center for Respectful Leadership. And when we met the first time, Gregg told me quite a fascinating story of his journey to where he is today. And as soon as we got to that meeting, I, virtually grabbed him and said, this story is incredibly inspiring. And I think a lot of people will really benefit from hearing about Gregg's journey. So Gregg, thank you so much for coming on the Way to Wow, People Making Money.
It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. So, typically I ask my guests to start as far back in their journey as they're willing to go. Maybe we don't have to start with, the day you were born, but, when you were, a young guy growing up and we were joking before the show started on Long Island, when you were out on the island, what were your thoughts about what you wanted to do when you grew up?
Well, it's a very powerful question because I, like many young people, didn't necessarily think very much about how my behavior was impacting other people. And I was arrogant. I was thought I was the best thing since sliced bread. And I had a mouth on me. In other words, I was very good verbally, whereas I was not that kind of physical person who was intimidating, but boy, I knew how to use my words really well. Mm-hmm. And I didn't hesitate. And it was only until I started to interact in a situation which I never expected to be in, did I realize how much the way I treated other people really does make a difference on how I'm going to be treated. You see, I was working in theater in New York City, and I was a starving artist like many other people. And I wasn't treated very respectfully when I was auditioning or even working. Theater people, we have issues. And I fell into a job where I got approached by the head of a training program with the New York City Police Department, who said, Gregg, I know you work in theater. I know you're a professional. We have a crazy idea that we could use actors to train police officers on how to interact with members of the public who are what we call EDPs, emotionally disturbed persons. Because traditionally what we've done is hit them over the head, throw the cuffs on them, and take them down to Bellevue Hospital and be done with them. But that's not really the kind of outcome that we at the police department want when we are dealing with people who are schizophrenic or off their medications or upset, suicidal, et cetera, et cetera. So me being young, arrogant, and brash, I said, sure, I can do that. And we put together a team of professional actors, and we created these scenarios based on actual things that had happened with police officers. and we recreated them on site in various locations throughout New York City to train cops on how to deal with people like this. And the program was enormously successful. At first, everybody thought, oh, this is going to be airy-fairy and it's not going to be very effective. Oh my God. Well, we hired really, really good actors. And it was far more effective than anybody thought it would be. And we had cops crying in the classroom because our actors were so good. Now, and this was the first time that I saw my talents and skills as a theater artist used in a way to make a profound difference in people's lives in outside of a theater. And the other thing that smacked me right between the eyes is, as I was growing up, and I think this is what you were alluding to, I didn't have respect for police officers. I had no respect for police officers. And the few times of the run-ins I had with them, I behaved terribly. And what I realized, that police officers are treated disrespectfully every single day. And I get that. Now, that's not to say that they don't behave badly. They do too. They're human beings. They behave very badly in many, many instances. But at the end of the day, I realized as a young man how important respect was in any relationship for it to be effective as a relationship. And that, for me, was the beginning of my career, exploring and trying to understand and teach about the importance of respect and something we call respectful leadership.
So I'm gonna take a step back before we move on, and talking about your theater days. So I was not a professional in theater. I did a lot of high school theater, but I'm a big fan of especially musical theater. So there's a certain language I think that gets used. So for example, oftentimes an audition is called a cattle call, or maybe that's just a Hollywood thing. And the
good point. Yes,
kids in the chorus are literally called the kids in the chorus, even though they're adults. So
yes,
would you talk a little bit about how the environment of theater impacted you as a young man, and did it, from the standpoint, did it support what you later identified as being let's say a way that wasn't serving you in your behavior?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. Yes, that's wow, what a great question. So the short answer is, the theater, like every other community, has a pecking order, has a hierarchy. It was, up until very recently, and even still is, male dominated to a certain degree. Now, what's interesting is that in many ways, the theater community is a haven for misfits, people who don't fit well into normal society, and who are different and unique, which means it attracts people from the LGBTQ community, for example. It attracts people who are, how shall I put it, more free-spirited, unwilling to stick in their swim lanes or play by the rules. So by nature, the theater is filled with very unique and strong individuals. And you may have read recently, there were some famous gurus who ran studios like, oh gosh, their names escape me. Elise Strasberg, for example.
Sure.
Big names in New York, who only now it's publicly being said how abusive they were, and the sexual harassment then went on, and the disrespect, and treating actors like absolute throwaways. And the musical theater, you're right, was not good. In fact, we there's a pecking order even in the inside of the theater, that the so-called legitimate theater people, the straight acting, the dramatic folks, look down on the musical theater folks. And quite frankly, the musical theater folks really didn't care, and often thought that the so-called legit straight actors were a bunch of pretentious, arrogant jerks who thought Shakespeare was the end all be all. And so at the end of the day, that there was an enormous amount of disrespect. On the flip side, and this is a long-winded answer to your question, but I just think it's a wonderful question, and I don't get to talk about this very much. On the flip side, it's an extraordinary community where you can be really weird and really different, and it's okay. You are welcomed. You are a part of it as long as you show up on time. You learn your lines. You hit your marks, and you don't abuse other people to the point where you can't do the work. And when it becomes a tight-knit cast of people who have worked together and struggled and sweated and bled and cried together, it's a family, and it's an amazingly supportive family. So does that make sense? There's kind of two sides to this coin.
I mean, and that's absolutely my experience, certainly in high school and community theater. There's the old song, there's no business like show business, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think anyone who's ever been in musical theater knows that song. I believe it's from Annie Get Your Gun, if I'm not mistaken, right? And that's sort of the ideal that theater people, or as my very long-standing friend Rick calls them, carny folk.
Yeah. Yeah, which is actually a subset. That's the circus folks, the carnival folks, the folks who travel around with the circuses. That's a completely different subsets. We often called the musical theater people gypsies.
Gypsies, right?
Because they would move from town to town with the show. You went out on tour with a Broadway musical on a national tour. You'd be gone 6 months to a year, from town to town to town, doing shows, and you'd wake up in a hotel, you wouldn't know where the hell you were. So whereas the so-called legit folks, they would do the show at one theater, open it, run for a few weeks or maybe a month or two, and then it closes. It's very rare on Broadway, for example, to have a straight drama run more than a few months, if that. But the musicals will go on and on and on because they're an attraction. They're a tourist attraction.
Right.
The theater is not. Straight drama is not.
So another aspect of that world that I'd like to hear your thoughts about is, you mentioned, you audition. It can be from my experience, a
soul destroying
process.
Yes.
As well, though, you can get through several layers of the audition, and it's like the old chorus line thing, gosh, I hope I get it. I hope I get it right. And then at the very last, it's like, nope, you didn't get it. And now, how do you pay the rent? How do you, buy food? Right. So there's also an aspect of kind of instability of income, if you will. So I'm wondering if you would talk about those a little.
Absolutely. It's a running joke that 99% of actors are out of work at any given time. And the ones who are working are looking for their next job. So one of the wonderful things, and this is a show about making money, is theater people are very resourceful and realize you got to have not only one side hustle, but hustle after hustle after hustle. For me, it was the restaurant industry. I've worked in one capacity or another when I was younger in 9 different restaurants. Wow. In fact, and everything from dishwasher all the way to maitre d', broiler man, you name it, I did the job. And I even toyed. So I did it. I worked my way through college that way, and in quite a few years after college. And I even joked at one point, because I'm a writer that's my nature. I write all the time. I was going to write a book called Tales of Restaurant Horror. But Anthony Bourdain beat me to it and wrote a book called Kitchen Confidential, and there it is. So, but I hustled. I hustled in every single job I could find, temporary work. The reason I was so successful in the restaurant industry is I could be all pretentious and be, I worked in some really high-end restaurants. And so I'd wear the tux and I'd look handsome and young, and I would flirt with the ladies, and their husbands would tip me extra money. I mean, it was just a crazy, crazy industry. But you could walk away from a decent restaurant in one night with $300 or $400. Wow. And you can't make that anywhere else.
Yeah. So interesting. I mean, in a way, it was almost like you were playing the role of somebody working in a restaurant.
Absolutely. And the best chefs not only are great chefs, but they also come out on the floor and they take praise and they talk about their work, and they're very eccentric, and they're putting on a show in addition to being an extraordinary chef.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note too that I think there's a tendency to look down at the dishwasher in the restaurant or the busman or whatever, but I think that there's nothing wrong with it's honorable work.
Yes, I did it, and what's interesting is I came from privilege. My father was a writer. He worked for the New York Daily News for his entire career. Mm-hmm. And so I came from privilege. We grew up in a household where we didn't want for anything. And it was a beautiful home on the North Shore of Long Island. Mm. But as a teenager, both my parents said to me, "You're going to get a job, and we're not just going to give you an allowance. You're going to have to work for that." So the first job I had was mowing our lawn, which is a very large lawn. Shortly, I got fed up with that, and I went to my first real job was in a restaurant as a busboy. I was 16 years old, mm-hmm. and from there on, I kept working in restaurants all the way through college. Yes. So it is noble. I also learned then. Yeah, and I only can look back on it in this perspective because you asked me about it. Mm-hmm. But I learned then that everybody on the team is important. They wouldn't be there if they didn't have an important role to play. And if you disrespected a team member, regardless of what they did, well, guess what? They're not going to cooperate with you. They're going to make your life and job that much more difficult. So I learned early on that respect is actually great coinage for getting things done. And people, if you treat them with respect, will go out of their way for you. Whereas if you treat them with disrespect, they'll just turn their back on you, and they won't lift a finger to help. Isn't that interesting?
It is. And, just to digress just a teeny bit, I was talking to a couple of young men day before yesterday, I believe it was, and they were working in a retail shop, and they were having trouble with their the register basically, and they were getting very flustered because they thought it was taking too long, and I said, hey, relax, it's okay. I mean, I'm not gonna. God forbid I would jump all over you because your system is slow or whatever. I mean, you're a person just like me.
Yes.
And so we got into this conversation, and one of the things I pointed out to them was, if you're out on a date, the best way to tell the character of the person you're with is to see how they treat, not the waiter, because you want something from the waiter, but how they treat the busman.
That's true.
You don't want anything from him.
Right. Maybe water.
Yeah, maybe. Right. And
right.
So I think that when you talk about the team in a restaurant, I think we as guests in a restaurant in some ways ought to look at ourselves as part of that team.
Right.
If we want good service, if we want a quality meal. So, join into the spirit of what all the people that, especially right now where, restaurants are so pressed for staff, they're short-staffed. It's hard work working in a restaurant, at least in my
It
experience.
really is. It really is. And the folks who do those kitchen jobs, they're not getting tips. Now, there is a movement afoot in many restaurants where they're saying, okay, we're going to pay everyone a living wage, and every member of staff, except for maybe like the head chef, will share in the tips of the evening. Mm-hmm. And which there's a part of me that goes right on. And then there's a part of me that says, well, when I was working as a waiter, I was dealing with customers with all sorts of issues and challenges and behaviors. And I was doing my utmost to please them. And there was a part of me that said, well, why should the guy who's washing the dishes get a share of my tips when I work my butt off for that customer? And I can understand how I had both perspectives, but at the end of the day, having been that dishwasher, having been that guy that the broiler, they called it the broiler man. I'm sure there are many broiler women, standing in front of that hot broiler and learning how to cook steaks just right. That's a skill, but you're not out on the floor. But that's a skill. You're standing there and figuring out and timing it all correctly. So why shouldn't that person share in the tips too?
So my daughter's in my favorite restaurant. I'll give it a plug. It's the Milky Way over on Pico Boulevard here in Los Angeles. If you have never been there, folks, go. That's all I can tell you. It's fantastic. So they did institute that policy where they pool tips, and everybody, I think, except for the manager and the head chef, share in that pool. And they always had great service. But one of the things I noticed is, especially when they're shorthanded on the floor, you'll even see one of the guys coming out from the back with his, white jacket on, helping serve, just, pitching in to make it go as smoothly as possible, because they're all in it together.
Yep.
And I think, I hear what you're saying. I can hear both arguments too. All I can say is in this particular restaurant, it works really well. And, I was talking to a new a waiter a couple of weeks ago. It was his first day. And he was saying, he says, he's walking in here. This is my first day, and I feel like I'm walking into a family.
Love it.
Isn't it
Love
fantastic?
It. Hopefully not a highly dysfunctional family.
Hopefully, right. Better than his real family. So let's move on now. You went from kid mowing the lawn like so many of us did just to get your allowance. I had the same experience. I think I got 25 cents for mowing the lawn and educated, and that was back in the 60s. So
yeah.
That look, that's what you got. My father housed me and fed me and clothed me, right? I'm sure you heard the same thing. So then from there, working in theater in New York, and then you got this opportunity with the police department. So the experience of working with people that you had formerly, I should say, let's say, not had a lot of respect for,
right?
Talk to me, if you will, or talk to us, if you will. How did that, if it did, how did that change you?
Oh, that's a great question. It changed me profoundly in that I could now understand from a cop's point of view what life is like out there on the street. Now, New York is a big city. It's a tough city. And it's I believe the largest police department in the country. So it's got internal politics up the wazoo. I mean, you name it. It's a rough organization to be a part of, not to mention having to police this extraordinarily diverse, tough East Coast city. And back in the day when I was living there, that we're talking the 1980s, the city was broke. The infrastructure was in tatters. We had crack wars, crime was high, murders, you name it. It was a tough time to live in New York City and a very tough time to be a cop. So I saw firsthand what it was like, and I actually became, here's another surprise, I decided to become an auxiliary police officer, a volunteer cop. And I worked parades. I worked the New Year's Eve in Times Square. I got a uniform and I got some training, and I was basically told to just stand around and keep your eyes open. And if you saw anything that was even remotely illegal, call a cop. You're not a cop. But at the end of the day, I too was treated with disrespect by certain people, even though I was an auxiliary cop. So I got an understanding of what that was like, and it really helped me understand how important respect was. Now, if you flash forward to the work that I started doing then, and one way or another continued to do, I realized when, and because now what I work in is diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership development, and so on and so forth. I realize now that when you're trying to teach people and train people, adults, about really loaded topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion, if you don't handle them and the topic with respect, it's going to go high and right real fast, and people will shut down and go to their corners. So I have had to learn how to be extraordinarily respectful to everyone. Now, it's something I also learned from my dad, who always treated everyone he met, regardless of who they were, with respect. And he instilled that in me. You are never better than anybody else. And so I was fortunate that my parents gave me that understanding. But it was only when I was really trying to wade in there as a straight white guy in a world where straight white guys are considered by many people to be the problem, to be the issue, to be the enemy. I had to wade in there and have conversations with people who saw me in that light, in a negative light, in a way where they would at least be open to the possibility that I was allied with them, and that I could be respectful about something that they felt I couldn't be respectful about, and therefore surprise them and perhaps see them, help them tear down some of the challenges they have and the biases they hold, quite understandably so. When you have 400 years of slavery telling you and treating you like a lesser human being, I do not blame any Black American for being incredibly angry. And I am constantly amazed at the generosity and the decency and respect that people of color treat, especially white men, after all that has happened in our culture. And the same could be said of almost every minority group, regardless. So that's what I learned, that going through life with blinders on and not acknowledging your own biases and just being your arrogant, unconscious self is very likely going to piss off quite a few people. And is that how you want to live your life? Just being your unconscious, arrogant self and pissing off a whole bunch of people? Or do you want to get along with people? Do you want to do good things in the world? Do you want to leave a positive impression? And one of the people I am constantly quoting, and it's kind of our slogan and our mantra here at the center, it comes from Maya Angelou. And when she was quite a little far along in her career, towards the end, she was interviewed by a journalist who asked her, said, Maya, you've done so much. You've met so many people. What have you learned about people? And it's a very famous quote. And she says, well, I have learned that people will forget what you said and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I want to live my life, and I encourage everyone to live their lives with that in mind.
So I want to dig into this, because if I mean, as you noted at the beginning, this show is about making money. I think some people hear that and they think, oh, so this is, let's be cutthroat, let's be,
Right.
whatever that means, right?
Right.
And I think that's exactly the opposite. So one of the slogans, if you will, that I coined in the book that I wrote several years ago about for people transitioning from the military to civilian life is wealth comes from value delivered, right? So
Yeah.
if we want to deliver value to another person, right? And this comes from, I think it's Zig Ziglar who says, if you want everything you want in life, somebody else already controls. So there's got to be, you've got to be able to create a relationship between you and the other person if you're going to get some of that. I mean, I suppose unless you're going to be a criminal and you're holding on, whatever, right? So setting that aside, right? So the key skill for us to learn if we want to make money is how do we create relationships, seems to me. And you've touched on something that I believe is at the core. I have one friend who describes it as, we want to treat all people decently. I think that maybe that's another way of looking at it. So I'm coming to the question now, how do we do that? It seems like these days, especially, it's so easy to really just inadvertently say or do something that makes a person feel bad, right? And then you get a negative reaction coming to you, right. And there starts the negative cycle. So how do we do that?
That's an excellent question. And I'll tell you a quick story, which is really indicative of how people can get so triggered when we tell them you have to treat others with respect. I was doing a keynote in Las Vegas about 6 months ago, and it's about 1,000 people. And I noticed this guy at the back of the room, and most people were sitting, but he was standing. And there's always some people standing, but this guy, not only was he standing, but he was kind of fidgeting. He was kind of marching around. He had his hands in his pockets. His shoulders were hunched. And you could just tell he was just annoyed. And he was watching me do my keynote, my speech. So bless you. So I said, I stopped because I had a hunch. And I just said, sir, you look really annoyed. You're damn right I'm annoyed. He just blew up in front of everybody's a freaking snowflake these days. Everybody's got to be politically correct. I've got to walk around on eggshells. Nobody ever treated me with respect when I was coming up through the ranks. I had to earn it. And this is BS. It's a liberal plot to take over he just ranted. And I'm nodding and I'm nodding and I'm nodding. And everyone else is looking at me. Okay, what is Mr. Respect going to say now? Right. So finally, he kind of ran out of steam. And I said, sir, I hear you. And I understand. You know why? Because I've felt exactly like you have. He's like, you have? And I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir. As I was coming up and building my business, I thought, my goodness, I can't say anything without somebody getting offended by me. This is so frustrating. But then I had a good friend of mine who hit me. I always talk about it this way. He hit me up the side of the head with a velvet covered 2x4. And what he said to me, he says, Gregg, I love you, my brother. He's a wonderful man. He says, I love you, brother. But you got to wake up. There are two things that have happened in this world that if you don't acknowledge that, then you are going to continue to fail and have problems and come into conflict with other people. And so what I said to this man, I said, here are the two things you need to remember. First of all, the world of work has changed radically since when you and I first started. I said, how long you been doing what you've been doing? He says, 40 years. And nobody ever coddled me. And I said, I believe it. You don't look like somebody who could be coddled. And everybody laughed at that one. And I said, I get that. I get that. Now, when I started, I was given the worst work. I was in a kitchen. I was washing dishes, and they would throw pots and pans at me, and they treated me like dirt in the restaurant. Absolutely treated me like dirt. But I realized over time that if I held on to that anger, I was not going to get my job done. So I just kept my head down and I kept going. And eventually I got promoted. I got better jobs. And I thought, okay, that's the way the world works. You've got to put up with that first. And now my friend said to me, that whole world is gone. That world is gone. Our millennials and Gen Zs are the most educated generations in history. They're about to represent 50% of all workers on the planet are going to be Gen Zs or millennials. And they do not tolerate disrespect for 1 millisecond. And, and I said to this guy, I said, you know how I know that is I've got 3 millennial children and they do not fit the stereotype. They are not slackers. They are really hardworking and they want to achieve and do great things in the world. But if you treat them with respect, they're going to go to heck with you. I'm out of here. And they can do that in today's workplace. They can do that. So the workers of today are completely different. The second thing that's changed is our work environment. He said the pandemic especially has changed everything. Roughly 1/4 of us are now working permanently from home. I don't know about you, but I am. I mean, occasionally I do go out. Yeah, there you go. So the world of work has changed. The environment has changed. The workers have changed. You've got to wake up to this. And if you still operate under the old paradigms that people have got to pay their dues and just let disrespect roll off their back, well, you could operate that way. But I'm telling you, you're not going to keep your best and your brightest. They're not going to stick around. So it's your job, sir. I challenged him. I said, it's your job to adapt. Are you the CEO? Yes, I am. Then it's your job to adapt. That's why you get paid the big bucks. It's not the responsibility of that Gen Z kid who just graduated college to adapt to you. You got to adapt to them if you value them and want to keep them. And he got quiet and he kind of nodded and I could tell he didn't like it, but he got it. And so did the rest of the audience.
So, and this is an interesting point, because as you were talking, you mentioned that this idea of paying dues.
Yes.
And look, I'm a baby boomer, so I paid my dues.
Me too. Yeah.
Postal service, right? Shoving things in, or no, you couldn't put them in the mailbox. You had to put them on the door or whatever, right? All that kind of really, annoying work that you did to make some money. So, it from your perspective, is it that Gen Z and millennials don't want to pay their dues or are unwilling to pay their dues? Or is it that they want the dues they pay to be, shall we say, meaningful?
That's a great question. I think that's part of it. I think because they are so educated and knowledgeable, and they come out of, these days, when you and I were growing up, going to college was an option, although my parents said it's not an option for you, but you could have a decent career with a high school diploma. You could have a decent career. Nowadays, if you at least don't have a bachelor's degree, but preferably a master's degree, you're not going to get a decent job that pays you the kind of money that you want. So these kids are getting highly educated, and they're not stupid. And so they come out into a work world where I know my kids do. They remember the Great Recession of 2008, 2010, that 4-year period where their friends lost their homes. Their parents lost their jobs. And they realized that the old contract, the so-called cradle to grave employment contract. You go to work for IBM. When you come out of college, you work your way up, you become a VP or something, you eventually retire, they give you a gold watch and a pension, and you're done after 40 years. That's gone. That is gone. They know that they are dispensable and that employers are hiring them for a specific task. And then if they're not needed anymore, or if things go south, they'll get rid of them overnight. So they're not stupid, our millennial children. And they're thinking, there's no loyalty to me. Why the hell should I be loyal to this company who's gonna, and all these titans of industry, especially the Bay Area, all these startups, these tech startups. Oh, we'll give you shares. We'll make you part of the organization. Well, that was handed out to a very select few. Everybody else got used and thrown away, especially if the company was sold off or collapsed or merged with another firm. So they know there's no loyalty left. So their attitude is, why should I pay my dues where I could go 6 months doing the worst possible job, and then the next day the leadership says, you're gone? No. So they're not stupid anymore. Back in the day, when there was more loyalty from the employer, yeah, we paid our dues because we knew it was going to turn into something. Today, it's not.
Interesting. So I want to refocus now on your personal career, or your specific career development. So you were doing the training for the police. How
Yes.
did you go from there to starting the Center for Respectful Leadership? Talk to us about that.
Oh, okay. I'll try to give
not too much time left. So
I'll try to give you the short version.
okay.
As I mentioned, New York was a really bad place to live during the 80s. And that's when I was doing that work. I got married at that time. I married an actor. And she and I decided we were going to live in the UK, where I had visited and traveled and saw the best theater of my life. And I said, let's move over there and see if we can make a go of it. We lasted 5 years. And we founded 2 companies. One was a professional theater company touring classic American drama throughout the British Isles. Mm-hmm. We actually made money doing that, which is, I know it sounds crazy. Wow. In the US, you don't really make money doing theater. But in the UK, where they have a 1,000-year tradition of performing arts and funding for the arts, you can get by. And we did quite well. The other thing we did, we started a school for performing arts for adults. And so those 2 things actually generated a very good living for us. So we had 2 companies. We eventually left and moved back to New York, where I took a job with a nonprofit training company that uses theater as a training tool. Back what I was doing before. And eventually I left there and moved to California and formed my own company using, again, theater as a training tool on leadership and on conflict resolution and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so one way or another, I was able to use my art and skills to do training for corporations and government on the tough topics. And eventually, I really wanted to focus what I've been searching for all my life, which was respect. Because again, in theater, people don't get a lot of respect. It's from others who are not in the business. And so I decided, with some help of my colleagues, that I would create the Center for Respectful Leadership after writing this book, The Respectful Leader. So that happened about 6-7 years ago.
Okay. So talk if you would about writing a book, because a lot of people, are very interested in doing that. I've had, I don't know if you know who Suzanne Woods Fisher is. She's a very prolific author, and she's talked about that. What I found, though, is different authors have different paths to, writing that book. So tell us about how you ended up doing that.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I've been a writer my whole life. My dad was a writer, and I was successful as a playwright and a script writer for film and television, but mostly as a playwright, mostly in the UK. And so I was successful. And I also worked, I had a side hustle in the UK. I was a journalist, and I worked for BBC Radio, and I worked for a number of UK media houses such as Scotsman Publications, the Independent newspaper, the Times of London, and so on. I was a freelancer, and I got to cover the fall of the Berlin Wall, by the way. And
Wow.
I had some really good editors. So when I started as a journalist, I was really new to it. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I had good editors who would beat me up the side of the head and take my copy and turn it into good stuff. And eventually I learned how to be a very good journalist and a good correspondent and feature writer. I graduated to writing magazine features. I interviewed some very famous people and wrote feature articles about them. So that was my journey to writing a book. And shortly after I moved out to California, I was doing a lot of training on human resource issues, and a number of my clients said, "Wow, you've got some great tools and techniques. Have you written a book?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, we'd love to have these in a book." So my first book came out in 2002. It's called Bad Behavior, People Problems, and Sticky Situations, a tool book for managers and team leaders. And it sort of just coalesced all the tools that I had put together over the years. And I brought that out myself before self-publishing was a thing. And I bought a book called The Self-Publisher's Handbook, and I followed it to the letter, and I brought my book out. And what it did was I decided to do it right after 9/11 happened, and all my clients dried up. So I thought, okay, now's the time to write the book. And the most important feature of the book writing process was me just keep going, keep doing it no matter what. And I made a commitment that by July of 2002, I would hold my first book in my hand. And I did, and it worked. And it really raised my credibility. And that's why I wrote it, quite frankly. Not to make money. You don't make money off of writing books, but to raise my credibility. And it did, and it worked. My second book, I decided I wanted to go after a big dog and be published by a major publisher. And that was The Respectful Leader. And it was picked up by John Wiley and Sons, the biggest publisher of business books in the world. And it's a business fable. And I got coaching from an expert in writing and publishing books who said to me, he said, "Okay, you want to talk about respect. That's what you care about." He says, "You got to realize that CEOs these days, they don't have time to read big, thick tomes, the ones that we have on our shelves. They want something they could read on a flight from LA to New York and back." So I wrote a fable, a business fable. It's modeled after Patrick Lencioni's book, Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And it's an easy read. You can read the whole thing, including the explanation of the story, in about two and a half hours. And it Wiley picked it up. It won an award from Amazon the very first day of release. It was named the best book of the month by the editors at Amazon in the business book section. And then a month later, it became a bestseller on Amazon in business books. And then a year later, it won a very prestigious award called the Axiom Business Book Awards for best. It won the gold medal for best business fable. So that was my journey. And you know, to your listeners who care about writing a book, and I'm literally writing my third book. Literally, I just stopped writing and got on this call with you. It's all about just keep going. Keep writing, set yourself a deadline. Now, my deadline for this next book, I have a keynote to deliver on my topic called Coaching for Respect, because I'm an executive coach, in September of this year. My book's got to be ready. So I have this external deadline, and this one's self-published. I started at my own publishing company. I don't want to deal with the big publishers anymore. I've been down that road. I'm a Wiley author. That's done. But at the end of the day, the best advice I can give is don't stop. Keep writing, even if it's only 10 or 15 minutes every single day. Write something, and it will get done. And make sure you set yourself a deadline.
I mean, absolutely sage advice. Very similar to what Stephen King talks about in his book on writing.
Yep.
And he would certainly know. But so we have just a few more minutes left, and there's been a question in the back of my mind that I wanted to ask you, and I'm glad we have the time. So, you know, you mentioned how millennials, Gen Z, they see that the company has no loyalty to them, so they're not going to have loyalty to the company. I can imagine that for their employers, their behavior may be interpreted as being coming from a place of arrogance.
Yes.
And from my own work, both in the business world and also as a chaplain in the Navy, one of the things that I've found is if we can come from a place of humility, so then if someone says something to us that may seem insulting, we can absorb that much more easily.
Yes.
Than if we're coming from a place of arrogance. And so I wanted to get your thoughts about that dynamic, if you will, because like you said, your sort of raison d'etre, as the French say, your reason for being is to help people build mutual respect.
Yes.
So I think there's something in that humility versus arrogance dance that human beings sometimes do. And so I'm gonna, if I hope you don't mind, I'm gonna sort of, take the grenade, pull the pin out, put it in your lap,
Okay.
say,
all right, I got it. And I was that guy when I came out of college. I was that extraordinarily arrogant, in your face human being who thought I walked on water. There's no question. And it was a different time. So I did understand about paying dues. I did understand that in that time. And I also understand why paying your dues no longer works for our millennial and Gen Z kids. But the arrogance part of me really had to be beat out of me by my friends and my colleagues and people who had the courage to call me on my stuff. And so if you are a leader in an organization and you have these young folks who strike you as arrogant and entitled, the best thing you can do for them is sit down with them and coach them, understand them, treat them with respect. And then when they feel like there's a level of trust between the two of you, introduce the possibility how their behavior, their arrogance, might actually not only negatively impact other people, but impact them and what they want to do. As much as we deride, you remember Sarah Palin, who is trying to make a comeback, as much as we derided Sarah Palin for all of her quirky, arrogant, entitled behaviors, she used to say something that I say now. And maybe she's still saying that, but she used to say, how's that working for you? And so if I could develop as a coach with an arrogant, entitled client, a younger person who just is pushing back against being controlled, who wants to do their own thing and go work from a mountaintop somewhere and come and go on their own schedule. If I could sit down with them and get a level of trust with them and say, is your arrogance, how is that working for you? Is it really bringing you what you want? And if it is, okay, great. But if it isn't, you might want to consider other pathways to collaborating, to working together with other people. Now, that's a process. That takes time. That takes coaching. That takes patience. And they say that once we reach our 60s, they call it the age of wisdom. And I kind of believe that's true. I'm 62 now. I only finally feel like I have that patience and I can do that coaching. Whereas even 10 years ago, no. If you're not, I was in my early 50s. I was still building this business, building this brand, and I was out there. So it was a long process. And sometimes you got to fall flat on your face. Sometimes you have to let that millennial screw themselves up really badly and then go over, pick them up, dust them off a little bit and say, you want to talk about what just happened there? I'll help you process that. But it's not easy. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it did. You know, it's interesting. I'll be 62 very soon. I think 2 or 3 weeks, right?
The new 52.
And lately, people have been commenting on what they see as my sort of extraordinary patience, and I have never been a patient guy. Right?
Yep.
You know, I hear this and I'm thinking, like, who are you talking to?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what I have noticed is somehow I think I've gotten to a point in life where I see the value of patience and what it will do, not just for me, but for my daughter, for my friends, for my business associates, etc. Just for people I meet on the street or someone I'm interacting with in a retail store.
Yes.
Right. It's an amazing tool to have in our toolbox.
And I would add, not to interrupt you, I'm sorry.
No,
I would add, you have very likely over the course of your career developed a high level of compassion and emotional intelligence and an understanding of where other people are coming from and giving people the benefit of the doubt that maybe they're upset because something awful is going on. I used to think when people cut me off on the freeway, I used to curse at them and want to drive up next to them and flip them a finger and all that kind of stuff. And I realized, well, who's that helping? How's that working for me? My blood pressure would go through the roof. I drive all tense and upset. So now I give everybody the benefit of the doubt. And I kind of tell myself a little joke as they go rushing by me and cut me off. I say, oh, there goes somebody who needs to take a poop. They got to take a poop. So they're going to, and I crack myself up. It's stupid. It's like a dad joke, but it works. It gets me from being all tense and angry at them to kind of having a laugh about it. And it's okay. You gotta pick and choose your battles. As you get older, you don't have the energy to fight every single battle anymore. You got to choose the important ones.
Very, very, very true. Very true. Gosh, there's so much more I would love to talk to you about, and unfortunately, our time is up. So
you asked the best darn questions. You asked the best questions.
Well, thank you. I mean, my goal in these shows is to provide a forum for my guests to really be able to kind of dig out from inside of them things that will impact other people, really, like we say in Yiddish, in the kishkas, kind of like inside us. Well, you grew up on Long Island, so I'm sure.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
maybe a time or two, right?
Yeah.
And really, you were so authentic in sharing your story, and I deeply appreciate that. I know that the viewers are going to connect with that as well. The time just zoomed by. So we definitely need to keep in touch, and as your work continues to develop, I want to have you come back on the show and hear the new ideas that you're working with. But before I go, I've got 3 things to do, and the first one is I see on the wall behind you what looks like a certificate of an award of some kind, like a medal. I'm just curious what that is.
That is the award that my book received. There's a sticker on my book, but that medal is actually the award. That's the gold medal.
That was the Axiom gold medal.
Axiom Business Books. It's a gold medal. They actually send you a gold medal in a beautiful box.
Wow.
And it's a big deal. They have a whole launch in New York City. All the publishers get together, and there's a big press conference and so on, and photos and all. It's a big deal. So I thought, you know what? I'm proud of this award. I'm proud of this book. It's a fun read. It's a good read. So I figured I'm going to display it prominently on my wall.
Tell us the name of the book one more time, because I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the book, so people.
It's called The Respectful Leader: 7 Ways to Influence Without Intimidation. This is the hardback version. This is the original version. It's now, if you want to buy it, if your readers want to buy it, please, you'll find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, but buy the paperback version, which is the newer updated version.
Oh, okay.
This is the old version. So,
so I'll put a link to the paperback version so people can click through to that. I'll put a link to your website, so if people want to learn more about your work, they can. And also, I imagine there's a way they can contact you through your website
yes,
as well.
yes.
So if
absolutely.
you have any questions or would like to engage you to speak or do a training, they'll be able to do so.
Absolutely.
So with two more tasks to do, real quickly. One is to let you know my guest next week is Steve Bram. Steve Bram is the co-founder and president of George Smith Partners. It's the largest real estate financing company, I think, on the West Coast. I don't think it's in the entire country. Steve has literally financed tens of billions of dollars in real estate finance. And you might think that a guy like that is going to suffer from arrogance. You know what? When I was teaching at UCLA Extension real estate, and I would ask Steve to come talk to the class, these were just brand new people in the business. He would come down anytime that I would ask him to meet with these, brand new people to real estate, help them learn, help them understand. He was always available to take their phone calls. He is one of the most humble people I know, and I think you're going to get a tremendous amount out of hearing Steve speak. So please do join us next Wednesday, 12:30 Pacific time, 3:30 East Coast time, and then 1 hour going in on each side as we move into the interior of the country. And so I just have one more task to do. Well, first of all, Gregg Ward, I want to thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Amazing guest. And so let me sign off the way I usually do, which was reminding you all about my dear friend Marie, who is up in heaven now. And Marie, darling, you are still my belle. Gregg, thank you so much.
Thank
All of
you, Kevin.
thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.